Good afternoon and welcome to the Leadership Institute's webinar. My name is Ben Woodward, I'm the Programs Coordinator here at the Leadership Institute, and today we're discussing salary negotiation. I'm joined by Steve Sutton, who's our Vice President of Development. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
Steve Sutton spent 14 years on the Hill before joining the Leadership Institute, where he was a startup specialist, hiring people to join congressional offices. I do want to remind you that today's webinar is being done live, and so you can send your questions to me via email at live@leadershipinstitute.org. You can also tweet them to me at #LIwebinar, and I will try and get through as many of them as possible. So to begin, I just want to open by saying, firstly, it's hard to know how to negotiate your salary unless you know what you're worth. I can go into a salary negotiation tomorrow and ask for $1 million from my boss. I'm not going to get it, unfortunately.
You should ask.
So, I should. So how do you determine what you're worth?
You've got to research what the market bears. You know, the silly, easy answer is that you're worth what the market will pay you. But how do you determine that? There are various methods. The more information you have, the more likely you'll get the raise that you want. So there are websites that you can go on that will calculate your salary, given what part of the country you are working in. People make different amounts in the same job around the country. You're going to make more in New York City at some job than you might in Kentucky or in a more rural area. I was going to say South Dakota, but actually the Dakotas, the pricing's gotten out of whack because of the shale boom. So I think payscale.com is one resource. Salary.com is another one. And these are websites that you can put in your years of experience, your education level, your zip code, and what part of the country you live in, and then the type of job that you do. And then it will come back and give you at least a starting point for the range of what your job should pay.
Yes. And is there any thought worth being given to its need as well? So, for example, obviously it's a lot more expensive to live in New York City or London than it is in most cities, say, in North Carolina or South Carolina, for example. So does that come into consideration? It
does, and that's the one area where need is I think, legitimate. It's hard to say to an employer, well, because I have student loans, or because I have credit card debt, you should pay me more. That might be a liberal's argument, but it's not often a conservative argument. But that the cost of living is more expensive is legitimate. And so that can enter into the negotiation as well. Typically, the employer will understand that, and their offer and what they will pay people will take that into consideration already. But maybe it's not. Again, it's difficult to say, well, I want to live in a penthouse, and therefore I need/want more money. You just have to feel that when you're in the negotiation.
Yes, of course, because it's still always worth considering that you're doing the same job in London as in, say, Birmingham in the UK, or say if you're doing the same job in Manhattan compared to, I don't know, another town.
Birmingham, just
you are being
not
paid,
UK, Birmingham, Alabama.
There you go, Birmingham, Alabama. You are being paid less if you're being paid the same salary, doing the same job in those two towns, because the cost of living is so much higher. So,
or because of taxes. When there was an NFL player who they offered a contract to play for a team in Florida, and they made the case to the player, this is more money than the other team is offering you, because there's no state income tax here.
Yeah.
He went with people just he wanted the more money, he didn't care about the tax.
It's a psychological thing. Okay, so during the recruitment process, you go through it, and it's a tense process. You put in the application, you get that interview, you go through the process. At what point during the process, from applying for the job to getting the job, do you begin the salary negotiation?
I think throughout this discussion, I'll explain what the ideal is and then what is likely to happen. Okay? Because there's two different things almost for every answer, probably. Ideally, you don't want to engage in a salary negotiation until after you have the job offer in hand. Now, the reality is that they may engage you in that discussion before they make you the offer. And so you've got to be prepared for that. So let's talk about the ideal. Ideally, you want to say, well, we can talk about that, or just kind of gently push it off, or I'm aware of what the job pays, or the range of this job, and I'm comfortable with that, and kind of just avoid the actual talk. Once they make the offer, then the salary negotiation can begin. It's going to begin anyway, even if they say this is the salary when you start out, because once they make the offer, you can counter. By the way, most employers expect you to counter. If you don't counter, they actually may think less of you, particularly for a sales job. If you're applying for a sales job and you don't counter, they're going to wonder if they made the right decision hiring you. So you're expected to. But in most jobs, they're not going to be offended. They're not going to rescind the offer because you've pushed back gently in a realistic manner. We'll talk about what that can be. So what if they push you, though, during the interview, what are your salary requirements? A common way to do this is they ask, what are you making now? In fact, there are some applications you have to fill out. What are you making now? So let's talk briefly about that. Never lie about your current salary. And that was true before the internet, but now it's so easy to verify how much money you're making. They could call your current employer and ask, and you'd be surprised how many employers will tell. You don't want to lie. What you do want to talk about, though, is your total compensation. That's legitimate. So if you're making $60,000, you can add up all of your benefits and say, my total compensation is $80,000. And that's not lying, it's not exaggerating, that is the total compensation. They may ask, does that include benefits? And you say, yes, it does. But in that, you can include your health care benefit, you can include any bonuses that you're expecting, as well as have received in the last calendar year. Retirement benefits count in that, so if the company's matching, or they have some type of a SEP IRA, you can include that in your total compensation as an example of how much money you are currently earning. And of course, metro benefits and cell phone and all the nickel dime stuff really does add up. $100 a month is $1,200 more. And so it is important to do your own research on yourself, know how much you're making. A lot of people don't know how much they're truly making because they only figure on their salary. Add up all the nickels and dimes and come up with your total compensation so you're prepared. My total compensation is Y, not X.
I see. And of course, some industries, it's worth noting, are not necessarily comparable. So for example, you might be doing a very similar job or applying for a very similar job, say in the private sector, but you currently work in a non-profit.
Right.
So you may be applying for a very similar job, but of course the pay is going to be very different.
Right.
And so is it ever worth looking into also the pay, say, of the other employees at that organization?
If you can, sure.
Using that as leverage.
And that's part of the research process. It's very important you have some idea what the jobs pay in your industry in general, and specifically for that company or comparable, because that's where you'll be in a stronger position when you're negotiating if those numbers are real and you're not guessing at them. And so you've got to do some research. And part of the research can be what are other people making? Now, many companies have gag orders and rules prohibiting the discussion of salary. But there are ways to find out. If you are applying for a job on Capitol Hill, you go to the clerk of the House report and it lists everyone's salary, so you can't get any more accurate than that. But to your point of the different scales in Washington, D.C., working in a elected official's office is probably at the bottom of the pay scale. Yeah. And then you get to the nonprofit world, and then you'll get into government, which actually pays a little bit better than those first two. And then you'll get into private sector, government relations type jobs, and then you get into lobbying jobs that pay the most.
Yes.
So.
And so what about the language, though? Because, of course, I'm sure it can be very easy, and it's a very awkward thing to talk about, isn't it? One's salary, it's not something we discuss on a regular basis, not with numbers at least. So talk about the language. Say if you're interviewing me and you say to me, what's your salary requirement? How do I phrase it in such a way that I don't trip myself up later on?
Well, that's why you've got to do your homework and do your research and be prepared so it's not a surprise, and practice it. Often they won't say, what are your requirements? They'll say, how much are you making now?
Yes.
That's more typically the question that they'll ask. And that's when you can ask them, my total compensation is, and give them the total number. And if they ask you to break that up, then break it up and be honest.
Yeah.
My salary is this, but my benefits are that. Because benefits do count. If they don't have the same benefits, it's reasonable for you to expect them to pay more on the salary side. You're not paying. By the way, stock options count for executives. Well, my stock options and then there's a value to those that you can compute. You want to give them that total package. If they say, what are your requirements, I would try to avoid that question. And I would say, I understand the range of the job, and I'm comfortable with that. You don't want to be interviewing for a job that you cannot afford to accept, given the range of that job. Yes, and that's happened a few times where I've made an offer and then the person asks for some ridiculous salary for like a legislative assistant. I said, the legislative director doesn't make that. I'm not going to pay you. I mean, do you understand what the range is for this job? Oh yeah, I understand. It's just that I want to be making $80,000. I said, well then, quite frankly, you've wasted my time. And you've wasted your own time. This is done, And so, but that's usually not the first question. Before we sit down, I don't want to waste my time. What are your expectations of salary? You assume people have done their homework and understand the range. Now, the ranges could be very, very wide. And on Capitol Hill, for example, some of the determining factors are your education level. People with doctorates and master's degrees are expected to make more than college graduates or non-college graduates. Longevity on the Hill, longevity in that job, longevity in that office all come into play. And so those are reasonable things to expect, that if you've been in the job longer, if you have more experience, you could expect to be at the higher end of the pay scale.
I see. And so you've got the job and you begin the salary negotiation. Is it better to do that negotiation by email, by phone call, in person? How would you go about that?
I think email is a bad idea because you get so many cues from face-to-face. You can get a sense if there's wiggle room or not, I think. So I think ideally you want to do it face-to-face. But on the phone is okay. I know people that will accept the job tentatively, I want to sleep on it, and then give a call the next day, and on the phone negotiate salary. That's okay, I think.
I see. I see. And also, when it comes to that sort of thing, what are your kind of negotiating points? So obviously, they might come and they say, well, we've got 150 people wanted this job. We can hire anyone just as good as you. So what are your negotiating points when you make that?
Well, first of all, once they've offered it to you, they have said you're the best one of the bunch. So to say, well, we have 150 people, well, then why don't you ask them all to fill out a questionnaire, and the person who puts down the lowest salary is the one you're going to hire. Once they've invested the time to actually go through the interview process and make you an offer, they want you to accept. And so at that point, they'll give you a number. We'd like to make you an offer at $38,000. Now, there's one of three things, basically, that'll happen at that point. You were only expecting $32,000, so you jump at it and you say yes before they come to their senses and rescind the offer. You could just accept it. But Morton Blackwell's Laws of Public Policy, number 37, you don't get what you don't ask for.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you might as well ask for a little more. The second option is that it's too low, it's unrealistic. You cannot accept it, given what you were expecting and what you think it should be, or maybe what your needs are. You can't accept it. That's a starvation wage for you. So there's either the absolutely yes, the absolutely no, and then there's the maybe. In the maybe category, you may accept it at 38. You don't have to tell them that. You can push back. And so that's when the negotiations begin. If you push back $80,000, they're going to think you're crazy. But if you're going to push back, assuming this is all in the range, if you're going to push back, you can easily ask for 10% more without offending anyone. In fact, you can go as high as 20%, in my opinion, more, without being looked at like you're crazy. Okay, so 12 to 20% or 10 to 20% is reasonable for you to kind of push back.
I see.
Now, there's just some phrases you can use to kind of push back. I have a personal preference. to me, the 7 magic words, which make the webinar worth the cost. It's free, right? Yeah, so it's worth
Pretty sure it's free.
Okay,
Yeah.
and it's worth the cost.
And it'll be on the website later.
That's right. Is that the best you can do?
Yeah.
Is that the best you can do? And once you ask that, you've got to just be quiet. You can preface it, that's very interesting, I really want to work there, I feel this is a real fit, I'm so flattered because I think this is a real fit, but I've got to ask you on the salary, is that the best you can do? You could say it other ways, is that negotiable? I don't like is that negotiable because anything's negotiable, and it's too easy for them to say no. No, it's not negotiable. Well, then where do you go from there? I don't know. Is that the best you can do? I guess they could say yes, but I just think it's a softer way to ask. Is there any room for negotiation? Is that a firm price? Figure out the phrase that you like, but be prepared for it so you're not surprised. Whatever number they say, is that the best you can do? We actually had a young man at Leadership Institute who left to work. He was a journalism. It was a job as a reporter, and he did this. And I think they offered him $30,000. And he said, I want to think about it. That's also reasonable. Then he gave me a call, and we sat down. And I said, well, tell me about the interview. And he said, well, it was odd because they didn't call us one at a time. It was everyone sitting in a room, and they called us in one at a time, which is kind of odd. I said, well, that's great. Who else was in the room? He goes, well, I was the youngest one in the room. I said, even better. So in other words, they were interviewing people with more experience than you. But they chose you. That tells me they have a larger budget for this position, or they wouldn't have been interviewing those older people, assuming you're equating age with experience, but I was and they were. And so that means there's more money in their budget than what they're offering you. So you call them up and say, is that the best you could do? So he calls them up. He says, is that the best you can do? I'd really like to take the job, but before I accept, I want to ask, is that the best you can do? They didn't put him on hold. They actually just put the phone down, and he heard them talking. He wants more money. What do we do? And he heard the whole conversation. And they offered him, I think, 35 or 38. I mean, they came up very quickly because it's in the budget.
Yeah.
And now you may not know that, but all you can do is ask. Then you can push back again. You're getting closer, but he just grabbed it. He would have taken 30. And by the way, the time to get pay raises is when you're younger. 25 to 34 years old is the time that you really should focus on earning more money, because pay raises are cumulative. And so, for example, if you get $5,000 more at the age of 25, by the time you retire, 40 years, it's not $5,000 times 40, which would be $200,000. The cumulative effect, because raises are based usually on percentage, the cumulative effect of $5,000 more when you're 25 is $634,000 by the end of your career.
It's quite an investment.
So all you youngins out there, start asking for more money, because it makes a huge difference.
It's
because
of understanding your own value and having confidence in yourself.
That's
and
true.
Your own worth.
And which is even why they expect you to come back and ask for more money. If you don't, they may very well think less of you. It's not going to hurt you, unless you have an unrealistic ask, and then you could jeopardize the offer because, well, you won't accept it. You don't want to come in with ultimatums. Okay, $30,000. I can't take it for that. I have to have at least 35. Then they come back and say, well, all we can do is 30. And now you've painted yourself into a corner of your own making. Okay, well, I'll take 30. Well, wait a minute. You just said that you can. So right away they feel you're lying to them. So the first thing that you've done is be dishonest.
Yes.
You don't have to say things that are dishonest. Well, that's interesting, but you can say, well, I have my expenses. I have college loans. I got a worthless college degree for a lot of money, and I've got to pay it off now.
We've had a few questions in from our
already?
Audience. I know, we're very popular.
Okay, the ones from my staff, the answer is no.
Well, we have about 14 from your staff. No, I'm joking. So this question is from James Kurtz. When they ask for your current salary and you are currently retired, but entering a second career, how is the best way to respond?
That's a great question. I think you tell them what your previous salary was. They're going to know that you're retired. I assume in the interview process that came up. And be honest. You can even say, I've had a very successful career. My last total compensation at my last job was $250,000, but I don't expect to make that. I know what the range is, and I'm fully prepared. I'm a saver, and I'm fully prepared for something in the range.
So taking a break from your career, it doesn't weaken your negotiation?
Well, it can, but hopefully you've worked that out when you're talking about the job. You don't want to accept jobs that the range is below what you would accept, and hope in the negotiation of salary that they'll offer you way over what the market will bear. I'm not sure that's realistic. So if you're being honest, you could tell them that my previous total compensation at my last job was X. And then tell them what you feel you need to tell them for the wiggle room. Unless you want to build from that, and then you just tell them that my last one was this, and to re-enter the workforce, I'm going to need Y or W or whatever.
I see. And so it's another question here. How much money should I expect for my salary if I've done a couple of years internships, but I haven't had a full-time job yet?
Well, again, it depends on the job that you're applying for and what part of the country you're in. Entry-level jobs are fairly easy to research.
Yes.
And so in some parts of the country, they're $28,000. Others, it's $18,000. So I can't really answer that. Do your research, and you'll get a good idea, even if you're new to the work market.
So I think that brings us on quite well to the next question, which is, so what are the differences between negotiating as a new employee, coming into an organisation fresh, and say if you are offered a promotion, or maybe you're having your annual review?
Right.
How do you go about negotiating when you're already on very familiar terms with the people you're negotiating with?
Well, let's start with if you're in your current job and you have an annual salary review. Again, there's typically three categories. There's people who will be getting the normal cost of living increase that everyone's getting.
Yeah.
Say it's 2%. And then there'll be people under that and people over that. The underachievers who are hanging on by their fingernails might get nothing and flatline. Or maybe there's been an agreement, we'll pay you a little more initially, but you won't be getting a raise for 2 years. And then there are other people who are overachievers and are going to get more than 2%, 4, 6, 8. And to put yourself in the best position for that negotiation, you want to bring to the table how you've helped the company, where you have saved them money, or the value that you've brought to the company, which is part of the review process, or should be, that maybe your boss and supervisor is not aware of.
Yes.
Now again, you can't say to your boss, well, you realize, sir, that, or ma'am, I did not burn the building down last week, so I've saved the company $20 million. And therefore, I deserve a hefty raise. It has to be something that's somewhat relatable to the job that you're doing and why you're bringing value. They don't want to lose you because part of your experience is that you've been trained by this company. And you're now at a point where they'd have to start all over if you left. So they're not going to want to leave, you to leave. Yeah. But statistics show people accepting your job from the outside, even promotions, make 10 to 15% more than people promoted from within. And so when companies promote from within, they're not really lowballing, but they typically don't give as large a pay raise as to somebody coming in from outside. Yes. Those people tend to get more. So what you can do to leverage that knowledge is to do an analysis of the industry and your salary, or to let them know that you've been getting phone calls, that you're not entertaining, but that there are people who are calling you from other. Again, you want it to be real. You don't want to just make stuff up. But I don't like, well, I have another offer, but I'll stay for more money, because that's almost like blackmailing them. I'm gonna leave unless you release my my cousin and then pay me more money, or I'll release your cousin and pay me more money. So be careful how you phrase that. But the fact that you're in demand and people are calling you, and people should be calling you. I mean, if you go to a conference, on Capitol Hill that frequently happened, where legislative assistant is meeting with a lobbyist and their client, and after the meeting they get a phone call from the lobbyist. Hey, we have an opening here. You really know your stuff. It happens all the time. You really know your stuff. Have you ever considered becoming a lobbyist on your issues? Because in the meeting, you're showing, I know the issue, I know the contacts, this is the right person to talk to on the committee, and the committee is not really going to pass this bill. The chairman is just kind of puffing on this one. Or, no, this is a high priority. You know the lay of the land. You're very valuable. And on the Hill, they'll typically come in and double your salary.
Wow.
And they just can't compete.
That's
why
not hard
there's.
to do, I suppose.
In the old days it was double. Now it's about 50% more.
I see.
We actually had a meeting once where turnover was so bad. We had a group of chiefs of staff that we had a meeting with a couple of lobbyists to try to address the issue of us losing staff and asking them how we can hold on to our people. And it was a breakfast meeting, and so. One of the lobbyists stood up and said, well, this is great, appreciate the meeting, but here's the deal. We will always pay more than you pay because our clients care more about these issues than your constituents do. And then he sat down, and that was the end of the meeting. Because, you can grab another bagel, and that was it. What are we going to say?
Thanks.
And so if you work on the Hill, you will be making less. But it's very common if you're making $60,000 for a lobbyist to swoop in and hire you for $90,000.
I see.
So
you've hired a lot of people, either at the Leadership Institute or on the Hill. Has anybody ever done anything during the salary negotiation that put you off hiring them?
Well, the one person who asked for $80,000 as an entry-level legislative assistant, that was just ridiculous. And so I guess the answer is yes. It's hard to be too aggressive in Washington because you're standing up for yourself, you're showing your value, and you're showing your confidence. And if your request is reasonable, within that 10 to 20%, I don't think anyone's going to be so offended, never mind, we rescind the offer. I just don't think. And if they do, I'm not sure you want to work there because they're revealing something about themselves to be unprofessional, bordering on petty. So I don't think so. I think you should ask.
So I suppose this leads on to a good question. So what would you say are the major don'ts of salary negotiation? What springs to mind as just the worst possible things that people could do during the process?
Well, ultimatums, I think, you shouldn't, like I said earlier, you should not say, I cannot take it at that, that's way too low, I can't survive on that. And then they come back and accept it. Then, so you were kind of lying.
Yeah.
And that's not a good place to be to start off in the office. I think that if you're honest, upfront, you've done your research. So one of the don'ts is don't not do your research. If you've done all those things, then you're in a not just a good spot. You might not get a raise. You're in a professional place, and that's all you can do is be professional. Ask for what you think the market will bear based on your experience. There's some other things that you can do that I'm sure we'll get to as well in the negotiation. Different benefits that you can request that you might not have thought of otherwise to add to your package so your total compensation is higher. Stipends and other things, which I hope we'll get into.
Yes, well, why don't we get onto that now? It's a question that I was certainly hoping to get onto. So what are the kind of key benefits beyond salary that people should consider when applying or when going through the salary negotiation? Again,
your research should help. You should know what other employees in a similar situation have been offered. They may offer you a Metro benefit. If everyone in the office is getting a Metro benefit, but you don't use Metro because you're walking to work, you may be surprised if you ask for compensation equal to the Metro benefit, even though you don't take Metro, you might get it. Or they might offset your parking if there's a cost for parking. If no one else drives to work, everyone's only getting Metro benefits, but you may be able to say, well, could I get a parking benefit? You'd be surprised, they might say yes. Because sometimes these funds come out of a different pot of money other than compensation. So there's more flexibility at the company to be a little more generous because that's in this pot of money. It doesn't show up on our books as compensation per se. So on the Hill, there's a very generous student loan repayment plan that some of the Hill offices don't even know about. And that could be many hundreds, I think $500, $800 a month. Well, $6,000 to $10,000 extra dollars to pay off the loan, and it's all green, it all spends the same way. That's very generous. All you have to do is ask for that. If you don't have a student loan, there's no, will you pay for my additional education? They might do that then.
Yeah.
And you can also work with signing bonuses. I haven't yet moved here, and I have expenses to move here. It's going to cost me $2,000 to move. Is that something you could help me with? Maybe they'll say yes, because they know that's a one-time expense, and it's not going to recur year after year in your salary. So sometimes signing bonuses, they're not just for professional athletes. You can have a signing bonus that doesn't appear. Because when they don't want you making more than people that have been working in the office for 2 years.
Yes.
But if they give you a signing bonus, you're not making more. So sometimes that can work. There's the typical 30, 60, 90-day reviews, and we'll review your salary. I'm not a big fan of that because it's too easy for the employer to do your 30, 60, 90-day review and not give you a raise. You're already working at that salary. My preference is that you ask for a specific raise in 90 days. I did that once with the congressional office, where I told the congressman that I'm willing to start at this salary, but in a year, I want to be making this salary, which is what I wanted, but I'll put up with it for a year.
And what was his response?
Well, he said, well, how do I know that you're doing a good enough job to earn that? And I said, you'll know because you'll still be employing me. If I'm not, fire me. But it's either if I'm still here, I want that salary. And he said yes. And in a year, I was still there, and I got that salary. So now, do you get these in writing? That's an iffy thing. I know very few people that do that, but I do know people that were promised something by a senior staffer. The staffer leaves, nobody knows about the arrangement, and you don't get that.
So
but in 90 days, well, I would make sure somebody else knows about it.
Okay.
That the congressman should know about it.
Yeah.
And then people, I think they're good on their word as long as they're still around. But I think you could say in 90 days, I'd like 10% more. Or I really wanted to start at 36, you're offering me 30, and so I call these step raises. I'd like to be making 33 after 90 days and 36 after 6 months, or after a year. And then your raises are built in. And that makes future negotiations easier because you know you're going to be getting that amount. And many times people can agree to that because that's another budget year. If you're asking for a 90-day raise in November, it might be very easy for that to happen because in 90 days, January will have occurred and they're under a new budget. And so they have more flexibility.
I see.
So that could be a technique that if it's at the end of the year that you can utilize.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't even thought about the calendar year.
Well, I'm glad I'm here then, Ben.
Yeah, very important. Learning a great deal myself. Just to remind viewers to...
Not too much, I hope.
Please keep sending your questions in. They've all been fantastic so far. It's live@leadershipinstitute.org. And the hashtag is LIWebinar. I will read out as many questions as possible. So, I suppose going on to... actually, one thing I was wondering about, I'd want to ask you, is there any merit in negotiating different job titles? So say if the salary is, you go into your annual review, you're told your salary is non-negotiable. Is there any merit to negotiating a more significant job title?
I guess that depends on the situation, but titles cost nothing. So it depends on, I guess, on your ego. If you're asking because then on your resume you can be a director or,
exactly.
And that sets you up perhaps in the future, whether at that job or another, then potentially. Certainly when you supervise people, you can expect maybe to make a little bit more money. But if you're just being given people to supervise so you can justify a higher salary, well, then you're just kind of playing games. And job titles can fall into that. So they can be real, or it could be gamesmanship. Napoleon once famously said, give me enough medals and I can win any war. I guess he ran out of medals at some point. But, and so like a medal, a title is kind of an adornment. But it's not unimportant. But I think most people would rather have the money, have the cash.
I see. And so I guess my next question is there any tactics that a recruiter might use to scare people off negotiating a higher salary?
Well, I don't know about, I see what you're saying, maybe intimidate them. Well, they could start out by saying, before we start our interview, the job pays $24,000 a year and not a penny more. Are you comfortable with that? And then it's Three Stooges time. I don't know. I've never done that to people. I've never heard of it being done. I suppose it could be done. And then you've got to answer, I suppose.
Yes.
Ideally, well, we could talk about that if I'm offered the job. Or you can say, I think the best answer would be, well, I've done some research and I know that the typical job in this category pays between 28 and 32, so I'm a little surprised by that. Perhaps we could talk about total compensation if you offer me the job.
Yes.
Or something like that. But again, if they're insistent, well, then that's it. There are some jobs, in the federal government, there are GS ratings, and there's only so much that you can make, and this is what the job pays. Well, then I guess you have a decision to make if you're willing to accept it or not.
I see. And so we have another question in. What if you give them a range? How do you end up at the top of that range? So I guess the question is, how do you make sure you get to the absolute top of that range that you suggested?
Well, you could narrow the range. Instead of saying 28 to 32, you could say 30 to 32, and right away you're in the top of the range. Or you give the range, and then maybe they offer you 28. And you could say, well, I think we're getting closer, but I believe I have more experience than most entry-level people. I think I'm really a good fit for this job. You would agree you're offering me the job, and then you counter.
Yeah.
Or you say, is that the best you can do, or is there any room for negotiation beyond that? You're already in the negotiation, so it's hard to say, is there room to negotiate, because they're thinking, we are negotiating. But you could say, is that the best you can do? Or you could say, I'm more comfortable at 30. We're very close here. I want to say yes today. I could say yes to 30. You're not saying I can't say yes to 28. I could say yes to 30. Is 28 the best you can do? And then at some point they're going to have to answer that. I guess it depends on how big the range is. If you say, well, I know that the range for this job is between $30,000 and $50,000. Well, then I think that's too big a range.
Yeah.
Hopefully you've done enough research that you can narrow the range to where you want it to be realistically.
I see.
And again, total compensation, which is a different thing.
I see. And out of interest, just to spin it around a little bit, from the perspective of a recruiter, say if an employee comes into your office and asks you for a higher salary, you want to keep that employee, but you can't afford to raise their salary. How would you approach that?
Again, it all depends. I would start a discussion, I guess you could ask: have you an offer elsewhere? Are you looking? Is there some reason that you're not happy here? I try to review salaries on a fairly constant basis, so that that the person's being paid a fair value. So they're not coming in and saying, if I don't get more, I'm leaving. And if they do say, if I don't get more, I'm leaving, say, well, then you're leaving, because I'm already paying you what I feel. I don't try to lowball people. But let's say you are being lowballed and you think that you should be making more. You come in with the facts and say, I know that for this job, with my level of experience, and then you come in and look at the things that I've done above and beyond what an average person would do. Usually it's within the end-of-year salary negotiation, though. It's not, or the annual negotiation. It's not just out of the blue, somebody walking in and saying, you know, I would like $5,000 more. Having said that, there's other things. You can give them more vacation days. You can shrink their work week to 4 days instead of 5 and give them every Friday off. You know, maybe they want to go to school and they need money for school. Well, I can't do that, but I can give you every Friday off so you can go to school. Well, there's a real value. I've essentially given them a 20% pay increase. So there are some things that you can do. Give them a better parking spot. I mean, it depends on what their priorities are and what you might be able to do within the flexibility of the company that you're working with. So those are just some of the things that might come up in that conversation.
So the answer to this may be kind of just, well, get over it. But a lot of people are a little too shy to do this. You know, it's an intimidating thing for a lot of people.
It is.
To ask for a meeting with their boss, to walk into that office and request a pay increase. What would you say to people who are thinking to themselves, wow, I could never do that?
Well, it's possible there are some people who are so shy, but if you're happy and you don't feel you're being taken advantage of, well then get over it. I mean, then there's no. But if you feel you're being shortchanged, if you don't have the courage or the to ask about it, then nothing's going to change. You won't get what you don't ask for. So in a way, you have to get over it. Now, having said that, maybe a surrogate can help. Maybe someone can go with you. Maybe there's an HR department person that you could talk to, so it's not directly your boss, and say, I'm very nervous about asking. Can you be my advocate? And maybe come in with me or ask on my behalf. That's possible, I suppose. So the HR person comes in and says, you know, I just met with, you know, Joe McGillicuddy, and he thinks that he's not being fairly compensated. It's awkward for him. He didn't want a confrontation, but he wanted to ask, is this the best that we can do here? And you might be surprised. That might actually, you know, oh, gosh, you know what? He has a point. He should be making another $2,000. Yeah. You know, and now you've got beer money.
And if the recruiter says no, what would you suggest the follow-up be to that? So is it worth saying, you know, all right, can we discuss this again in 6 months?
You can. Well, one choice is to leave. If the job market really is healthy enough in your industry and the range that you researched is accurate, you may have to leave that firm and go to another one. You can revisit things, but I prefer a promise, you know, rather than, well, we'll talk about it in 6 months. Okay, well, we'll talk about it. We just talked about it. We're going to keep talking about it. Now, if I'm still here, I'm bringing value to the company. If I'm still here, I want to be making, and then give the number. And try to get an agreement to put it behind you and know that it's coming. And I think that can be very useful, particularly if it takes you into the next budget year, fiscal year or calendar year, when there is more flexibility in their budget to do those things.
Yes.
That can work much better than people think.
I see. So we have a couple more questions in.
Sure.
So we kind of touched on this before. I've been asked, is it appropriate to bring up personal life goals such as getting married or starting a family as a reason behind asking for more compensation?
Personally, I don't think so. Everybody has, you know, I'm going to pay someone more because they're married and have children or plan on having married, because they want a bigger house, because they want a more secure retirement, because they want to retire when they're 50 and everyone else wants to retire when they're 60. So I should pay you more? Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work. And I think it shows a distortion of the negotiating process. You want to talk about your performance, the value that you bring to the job, and why you should be compensated because of the job you're doing, not because of your needs. Okay?
I see.
Unless you're a liberal. That's a liberal who asked that question. Okay?
Maybe.
All right. Bernie Sanders, get off the stop asking questions, Bernie.
Okay, and so again, we kind of touched on this a little more, but I'll ask you into more detail again. So, say if you don't have a performance review, this viewer's asked kind of how do you go about kind of asking for that meeting, and you know, do you go ahead and tell them that it's about a salary review already?
It's difficult because hopefully in every organization there's an opportunity for salary discussions on an annual basis, and that's when the supervisor's expecting there to be a discussion. And if you just kind of pop in, oh, by the way, it can be difficult. And let's face it, you'll get to do that once. You know, they're not going to want to see you every 3 months for a salary discussion. And after you do it the first time, they're not going to want to see you on an annual basis in the middle of the year. At some point, you have to get into the routine that the company has established for salary discussions. That said, I think it's okay in the middle of the cycle to have that discussion for whatever reason. And let's go back. I mean, if you've just had your 17th child, hopefully, you know, there's enough, people know this. And so the boss is going to know that you've got these things. You're about to send your child to college. But I just don't think it's fair to ask, well, I want to send my child to a private school. Can I have a raise? When the other people aren't in that situation, so you're actually going to entertain paying someone more because of their lifestyle choices. I don't know that works very well.
I understand.
I know who on my staff are having children, you know, so I'm already kind of, I won't say I'm thinking about that, but if the job will not sustain a family, then you may need another job.
And what if your company, so I've got another question here. So what if your company doesn't have any planned reviews, which I've worked for employers in the past that didn't. How do you go about asking for that?
Well, then I think on an annual basis you can walk in and say, you know, I would like a review, or I'd like a salary review.
Yes.
That's reasonable.
I understand.
Yeah.
And on the reverse of what we were talking about a moment ago, when you were saying, you know, you wouldn't want to say, you know, sending my 17th child to private school, or whatever. Are there aspects or things that you should withhold in case your employer uses them against you during a salary negotiation?
I'm not sure there's things that you should withhold. I mean, keep in mind there are certain questions employers are not allowed to ask you. So being a private person, you might not want to share those things. They can ask how many children you have. They can ask you if you're married. Those are illegal questions to ask in job interviews, although that's, I'm sure, violated all the time. You can ask, is there anything that would preclude you from working on weekends? But you can't say, are you, married with the children? And so I don't know if I can comment any more about that, per se. I would like to add one other thing. When you do ask for raises or salaries, try not to use round numbers. Try to use very specific numbers. Don't ask for a raise. Did we already talk about this? Or
no, not yet.
Okay. No. When you ask for a raise, don't ask for a $5,000 raise. Ask for $5,352. It just works better. Psychologically, they're thinking, wow, you really must have done your research to come up with that number. They may say, how'd you come up with that number? Well, I've looked at several websites. I took an average. I know peers and what they make, and that's from my research, that's the going salary in the area. So I thought I'd be, I would base that on my research, and they'll be very impressed that you've spent the time to research this. And I won't say it scared them a little, but it gives them more information. Wow, that really must be the going rate if they went to all that trouble. So come up with oddball numbers for your salary and or pay raise requests. It really works.
I see.
It really works.
That's good to know. I hadn't even thought about that at all. So that does make sense. So earlier I asked you to...
Not to the penny, but,
a broad number. So I asked you earlier to kind of summarize the kind of the don'ts. So just before we finish, what are the kind of summarized do's of salary negotiation?
Be honest. That's got to be at the top. Do your research so that you have information. Information is power. and don't be afraid to have the discussion. You've got to stand up for yourself, and if you don't believe in yourself, nobody else will. So you've got to do those things, but do it in a friendly way and in a asking kind of way, and you may find that employers are much more flexible than you thought they would be.
Yes. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think the only other thing I would ask you is whether there's anything you feel that has been left out of today's discussion, anything you would like to add to it.
Other than I think you're making too much money, Ben. So no, I don't know. No, I think that we've kind of covered everything. It's difficult in the actual negotiation when they're pushing you to give them a number, and you're trying not to give them a number. That's probably the most difficult time of the negotiation. Do the best you can. Try not to talk about it. I think you should always counter, because they may be not lowballing you, but they may be starting low, anticipating you're going to counter. And if you don't counter, then you've left money on the table, which will accrue over time in a dramatic way, or it won't if you've not gotten that. Now, having said all that, there's an old saying that you should try to learn in your 20s so you can earn in your 30s. And so there's something to be said about taking jobs that may not pay as much, but will expose you to as much learning about your chosen field as possible.
Yes.
If you can afford to do that. And so you should think about that when you're looking at job offers as well.
And that's a good point, especially for those who are interested in working on the Hill or say on non-profits.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are many of those staffers could be making more money. As you said, in the private sector you get jobs and lobbies,
Right.
but sometimes it's always worth noting in these discussions about money that sometimes the job in itself is a benefit. If you're doing something you love doing, then that's
why
crucial.
having a lot of college debt inhibits that, perhaps. But there are Hill staffers that wait tables in the evening or 10 bar to get them through that, or sleep on sofas for a year for the experience. And there's the whole unpaid internship thing that we haven't talked about, but this is a salary negotiation discussion, or salary, not free internships and how to survive in D.C.
Yes.
But carry around plastic bags with you. So at any reception, you have dinner and breakfast right in your pocket.
Okay, so I think that sums up our discussion today on salary negotiation. Thank you so much for being here and for tuning in. We really appreciate you being here. Our webinar will be on our website later on, and so you'll be able to do that. Thank you so much to Steven Sutton for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
I would also like to remind viewers, so the link, by the way, to find our webinars is leadershipinstitute.org/activism on demand. In addition to that, the Leadership Institute's Careers Division does offer a number of resources that you can use, whether it's on discussions on salary negotiation, whether you want your resume reviewed, whether you want a career consultation, practice interviews, whatever it is. The Leadership Institute's Careers Division is always there to help. And you can find our resources at www.conservativejobs.com/resources. So please do look for those. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.